Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway. Today I'm going to be taking two of the same locomotives but from different manufacturers and putting them head to head. It's quite rare that two different manufacturers will choose to produce the same model, particularly at the same time as each other. That is until recently. It seems to happen quite a lot these days, but in the past it was quite rare. But I have been able to find an example where two different manufacturers have produced two of the same class, and I think it's going to be fascinating to compare the two. So, the two locos are the Bachmann and the Hornby Hall class locomotives. So let me introduce you to these two locos. So we'll start with the Bachmann one. This is the Bachmann Hall class. This is Sketty Hall, and the earliest reference I can find to the Bachmann Hall class comes from around 1995 with this example, which is 31-775. Although this does not appear to be the same as Bachmann's modern Hall class locos. The detailing looks quite a lot different. So this example from 2004 seems to be much more like Bachmann's current offering. This is number 32-001, and it does appear to be the same tooling as Bachmann's modern Hall class. So it's pretty safe to say that the Bachmann Hall class dates back around 20 years, give or take. And for today's demonstrations, I'm going to be using Sketty Hall in the beautiful Great Western lined green because that matches the Hornby Hall class, which I'm going to show you in just a second. Now, Sketty Hall here is an older Hall class. It was produced a few years ago, but I did an investigation last year to find out whether Bachmann's more modern Halls are the same as their older ones, and they in fact are, and you can look at my investigation there. So yeah, the Hall class from Bachmann is still available today. On the Bachmann website, it has an RRP of £174.95, so we're talking the best part of £200. So let me show you the Hornby Hall class then. So here it is. This is Adderley Hall, also in the early Great Western green, which looks absolutely amazing. Now this is a much more recent model. The earliest reference I can find to this is somewhere around 2013, 2014. I think it was released around 2014. So it's approximately 10 years newer than the Bachmann Hall class. However, it wasn't released as a main range Hornby Railways locomotive. It was actually released as a Hornby Railroad loco, so a cheaper, simpler model. But the most interesting thing about this is that 2013-2014 places this model in around the same era as the Design Clever models, basically where Hornby knocked the level of detail right down but still charged quite a lot for them. It didn't work and they don't do it anymore. But it is particularly interesting because this Hornby Railroad loco has a lot more detail than a lot of other Hornby Railroad locos, leading to quite a lot of suspicion that this was originally destined for the main range, but then given the failure of the Design Clever models, it ended up as a railroad loco. Either way, it's a really nice looking locomotive. The regular version of this class hasn't been available for a year or two, but it is still available from Hornby as the Hogwarts Castle locomotive for £109.99, which is some £65 cheaper than the Bachmann Hall class. Now you might say that to compare these two very different models is a little bit unfair, but actually the thing is this Hornby Railroad locomotive has a lot more detail than most Hornby Railroad locos, and this Bachmann Hall class has a lot less detail and a lot less features than most of Bachmann's locomotives, so it's actually a much fairer comparison than you might think. The second reason people might say this is unfair, and I don't understand this, people use this argument all the time, but they say because this is a 20-year-old model, it's unfair to criticise it these days. But the reason that argument does not work is because this model, or the Bachmann Hall class, is still available today for the best part of £200. Now, if Bachmann had discontinued this 10 years ago or whatever, then yes, it would be unfair to compare this to a modern Hornby loco, but they didn't, so it isn't. Now, I think to me this is obvious, right? And I think to most, 99% of people, it's obvious to you as well. But every time I review a slightly older model, even if it is still available in 2021 or whatever, people use this argument to say it's unfair because the tooling dates back 20 years or so, even though it's still being sold for a lot of money. So As baffling as it is that people aren't getting this, I'm going to try and put it another way just to make this argument clear, and so that hopefully people get it and stop leaving these stupid comments about it, right? So let's imagine that I am a manufacturer of digital cameras, right? It's a horrible thought, but let's just imagine it, right? And at the end of the 1990s, I released an early digital camera, right? Now, bear in mind, at the end of the 90s, digital cameras were very new. They were absolutely awful by modern standards. But of course, at the time, digital was the new fad. It was amazing. Everybody wanted it, and they were very expensive, okay? So my digital camera, rubbish as it was, well, by modern standards, cost around £1,000, okay? Seems crazy, but that's pretty accurate for the era. Now, fast forward over 20 years to 2021, and I am still producing my 1998 digital camera, okay? Now, I'm still selling this for £1,000, bearing in mind modern cameras are so much better than that, and they're so much cheaper. Now, the fact that my camera was designed over 20 years ago does not mitigate this deal, right? It does not make this a better deal. It's not an excuse for why I'm still selling an ancient camera for £1,000, okay? Possibly more due to inflation, right? So why would it be unfair of my customers to compare my terrible overpriced camera to newer, cheaper, and crucially better cameras that are also on the market at the same time? It wouldn't be, and to suggest otherwise would just be utter nonsense. So hopefully you can see that any argument to the contrary is just totally invalid, and frankly it's baffling that I'm still having to talk about this. And the exact same thing is true of model trains, right? Just because a model is 20 years old doesn't mean that you can't compare it to newer models if it's still being produced at a price that is similar to newer models. That's the point. It seems fairly obvious, but no, I don't think this is an unfair comparison. But let's go back to the initial point about the Hornby Railroad loco being more detailed than most railroad locos, and the Bachmann Hall class being less detailed than most Bachmann branch line locos, because it's actually really difficult to say which of the two locos has more detail. Some areas Bachmann wins, other areas Hornby wins. So let's take a closer look at these two models. So Bachmann does quite a few things better than Hornby. For example, theirs has the real copper chimney, which just looks amazing. There's no substitute for real copper on parts like that. And then you've got Hornby's, which is just plastic, and it does not look anywhere near as good. Bachmann's do actually come with etched name and number plates, which is a fairly premium feature. Hornby's don't, you just stuck with whatever was fitted to the model. Bachmann's Hall class has painted cab detail, which is a fairly standard feature these days, but Hornby's doesn't as a railroad loco. And then Bachmann's has greater fidelity in various details, for example around the underframe and such. Hornby's doesn't. The moulding is a little bit more basic in some areas on Hornby's. Bachmann's has various separate pipework around the boiler, and then Hornby's doesn't. So you might be left thinking, well, Bachmann's is obviously far better, but then there are loads of features on Hornby's model that are missing from Bachmann's. For instance, Hornby has some separately fitted parts that Bachmann doesn't. Look at the detail here on the side of the smoke box. The whistles look far better on Hornby's as well. They are sort of separate pieces, whereas the Bachmann ones seem to be just extruded from the back piece of the whistle bonnet. So that looks a lot better on Hornby's. Hornby's has very fine looking lamp brackets, whereas Bachmann's halls, even to this day, still have very large chunky ones which don't look as good. Hornby's has more detail on the coupling rods and particularly on the cylinder crossheads as well, whereas Bachmann's has quite a lot less detail, not quite as convincing on the Bachmann's. Hornby's has fully moulded realistic wheels, which are realistic right down to the axles. Bachmann's don't look as good. I think the finish is better because they are cast metal, but to me they definitely look less realistic because the axles just look a bit of a mess, don't they? You can see the real axles on the model. Hornby's has a metal reversing rod which has a really nice realistic metallic shine, whereas Bachmann's has a much cheaper looking plastic one which I don't think has the same effect. And even though Hornby's cab detail is not painted, there is a lot more detail there. You've got the regulator which pokes out, loads more detail in terms of gauges. Bachmann's is painted so it looks a bit better from a distance, but on closer inspection it's actually a far poorer cab. So actually, when it comes down to the physical level of detail, the two models are quite closely matched, aren't they? I think you could make a good case for either of these two models being the most detailed. However, when it comes to the decoration and the finish of these two models, there is a clear winner, right? And that is Bachmann. So Hornby's Hall class does have lovely lining, it does seem to be pretty accurate, and it's also pretty complex given the fact that this is a Hornby Railroad loco. It does make you wonder what they would have been capable of if this had gone into the main range, although I'm glad it didn't, because obviously it doesn't really have the level of detail required for that. But the finish on the body is very, very flat and matte, and the same is true of the running plate because it is just made of plastic. Now just look at Bachmann's in comparison. It's just immediately obvious that there is a huge difference here. So Bachmann's Hall class actually has a fully metal running plate, which of course produces a far better looking metallic finish than Hornby's, and of course there's a lot more weight there as well, which is pretty good. Bachmann's lining, I would say, is equally good when compared with Hornby's, although it does exist in a few extra places. You've got a lot more lining around the cab area, and the cylinders, for example, have been lined as well, but I think that's just because this is a Bachmann branch line loco and the other is just a Hornby Railroad loco. So again, it's been deliberately simplified. I think Hornby would have been capable of doing more than that. However, it's really the finish that sets Bachmann's Hall class apart from Hornby's. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous finish. You've got this lovely sort of satin finish, much more luxurious looking, and even the very shade of green that Bachmann have used here just looks deeper and richer and better than Hornby's. Now that's not to say that it's necessarily more realistic than Hornby's, but having seen quite a few green Hall classes in my lifetime, I must say I think the Bachmann one does look a little bit more like the real things, but then again, of course, that is quite subjective. Don't forget though that Bachmann's model does have this rather off-putting parting line which goes right across the top of the boiler. Hornby's doesn't have anything like that. The boiler is completely smooth. So even in this category, it's really not the complete walkover that you'd expect it to be. So far then, it's a toss-up, isn't it? There is no clear winner so far. Some people might prefer Bachmann's for the better finish, the superior metal running plate, the painted cab, but then again, quite a few might prefer Hornby for the slightly higher finesse in the bodywork, the better wheels and the better cab detail. Mechanically though, the two are really quite different. Yet again, not quite as different as you might expect given Hornby and Bachmann's respective track records, pardon the pun, when it comes to mechanism, but nonetheless there are quite serious differences between the two. So Hornby's mechanism is by far superior in my opinion, but it's not quite up to Hornby's high standard that we've become accustomed to. So you do have full tender pickups on the Hornby Hall class as well as loco pickups, so continuity with the track is fantastic. The DCC socket is in the tender, which is a huge advantage because it's so much more accessible there and there's so much more space there for sound and speakers and larger decoders. It doesn't have proper bearings though, which is a real surprise because nearly every Hornby loco has those. Even the incredibly basic Hornby Railroad 060s and stuff have those, but the Hornby Hall class does not. It's one of very, very few Hornby locos that doesn't, so that's a bit of a shame. And I do suspect that this is just a 3-pole motor in here as well, although it does have a flywheel, as you can see. So the Hornby Hall class is not actually as good as most Hornby locos are, but the Bachmann Hall class, as far as I'm concerned, is far worse. So the Bachmann actually has no electrical connection to the tender of any kind, let alone tender pickups, which means you are just relying on the 6 pickups going to the loco's driving wheels, which in this day and age is far from ideal. Because of this, the decoder socket is also crammed into the loco, where there is incredibly little space. And in fact, if you do want to fit a larger decoder, you actually have to remove a weight from the chassis so that you can fit the decoder in. So actually chipping your Bachmann Hall class might mean that you've got to sacrifice some of its weight. So that's not very good. It also has no proper bearings, as you might expect from Bachmann. So Hornby, Bachmann, probably quite even there. And it also, of course, just has a 3-pole motor, but this time no flywheel either. So this is really where we start to see Bachmann lag behind from Hornby, particularly given how much more expensive the Bachmann Hall class is. This is the point where the two start to diverge from each other. But we have not talked about performance. As we found from a lot of my reviews, a good mechanism, a bad mechanism, that might mean a lot for the longevity of a model, but out of the box performance, it can still go either way. The poorer mechanism can sometimes win over the better one, even though in 10 years time that might not be the case. So let's get these onto the track, let's weigh them, let's do some actual testing, and let's see which one performs the best. Right, so I'm live at the scales with you now, which is almost unbearably exciting, isn't it? So first up then, we're going to put the Bachmann Hall on. This is going to be loco and tender. So this weighs in at 329 grams. Now this particular Hall class has no weight in the front of it, so this is about what your loco would weigh if it was DCC fitted. You can take 329, oh well it's 330 now, whatever, and add the weight of your decoder, which is a gram or two, and that would give you the weight under DCC. However, I do have more than one Bachmann Hall class, of course. I have been very thorough. This is one of them that does have the weight in the front of the loco, just make sure it's all on there, which is 343 grams. So we're talking around 13 grams heavier. It's not a huge amount, but that can be quite significant in terms of pulling power. And in fact, interestingly, this loco is much newer. I bought this brand new last year from Bachmann's 2020 range. And so this is the one I'm going to use for most of the performance because it's most representative of what you'll get when you buy your loco new. And that's fair because the Hornby Hall class that I'm using was bought new 1 or 2 years later, but it hasn't degraded in performance at all. Anyway, enough waffling. How much does this one weigh? So that weighs in at just 246. Is that right? I think the tender might be touching. I thought it was a bit more than that. Yeah, 252 grams. So I've made it a bit better by putting the tender on properly, but it's still the best part of 100 grams lighter than the Bachmann Hall class. But which of the two models will be the better puller? Pause the video if you want to and comment down below what your guess would be. If you've seen my other Hall class videos, you might already know. But let's get them down onto the track and do a bit of a performance comparison. So we're going to start with Bachmann's Stanway Hall. Like I say, this is a recent one which has been running, and it's about, I've had this less than a year now, so it is still basically brand new. So let's see what the speed is like first of all. I'm going to run it past at 50% speed. So not very fast, fairly slow. Is there very much torque there? Let's see, put my fingers in front of it, give it 50% speed. Loco spinning its wheels very, very slowly. Okay, and then finally, what is the crawl like? Let's have a look. Nice and slow. Easing it up, I'm turning it up. And there we have it. So, can I go any slower than that? So that's actually pretty good. That is very, very good and slow. It's a little bit on the jerky side, but overall that's pretty smooth. Oh yeah, tiny bit of cogging. Obviously there is no flywheel, so that's to be expected. That's pretty good. Now, here's an interesting point for you. This goes back to what I was saying about longevity and better quality mechanisms lasting longer. The older Bachmann Halls that I have are not that good at crawling. So here is Sketty Hall, as you can see, not so controlled at the slow speed, noticeably more cogging, noticeably more hesitation in the rotation as well. Things do seem to seize up at certain points in the rotation. And the same thing is true of my other Bachmann Hall. This one is St Edmund Hall, and this one performs very much the same, which isn't concrete proof or anything, but it is good evidence of that slight degradation in performance over time as a result possibly of the poor quality mechanism. So we'll talk about pulling power in just a second, but let's put the Hornby Adderley Hall loco onto the track. This one's also bought new and it has been running, and it's been serviced a few times as well because I've had this more than a year. Right, let's see what the 50% speed is like. So I would say that is about the same. If I play the clip of the Bachmann Hall running past at the same speed again, yeah, I would say that's similar. So the gearing is going to be similar, isn't it? It does seem quieter though, I must say. Somehow this one is quieter. Let's have a go at the torque test. Much, much more torque in that mechanism. Look at that. In fact, I think the wheels slow down barely at all. to make sure I'm not pushing down. Yeah, so this has a lot more torque than the Bachmann does. And now let's try the crawl test. Here we go. Speed it up, speed it up. I am increasing slowly. Oh, I think it started. Yeah, it is. So it's cogging a little bit as well, which is strange because this will have a flywheel inside, but that's a lot slower than Bachmann's was able to handle. So does that mean if I try and speed it up a bit and match the speed of the Bachmann's, it will be smoother? No, it's still a little bit jerky, isn't it? So the slow speed is surprisingly good for a 3-pole motor, but if this had a 5-poler, I would expect to see slightly better performance. That's pretty good though. So it's similar, isn't it? It's really similar to the Bachmann. And yeah, this is reasonably consistent with my other Hornby Halls. Here is one of the halls that I've had for a little bit longer. This one is Alton Hall. This one doesn't seem to have degraded at all though. It performs more or less exactly the same as Adderley does, although it's not as old as some of the other Bachmann locos, so maybe there is time for this to get worse. And then here is Pitchford Hall. This came from a train pack. This is a little bit older. I think this would have been closer to the original release date for the Hornby Hall. But as you can see, the performance is more or less exactly the same at the slow speed. So Hornby is winning so far for me on performance. The slow speed between the two is pretty similar. I think Hornby's is slower, but it's a bit more jerky. Bachmann's isn't quite as slow, but it's a bit less jerky. But Hornby's is quieter and it's also got more torque, as we can see. Now, I'm now going to do the power, or the haulage test. Now, this Hornby one that I'm doing first should be the least powerful of the two because it's obviously lighter. But as we've also seen, there's a lot more torque in the Hornby mechanism. So let's have a look. I'm going to make sure this needle is set to 0. I will read out the values because you might not be able to see them too well. And I'm going to set this to, let's get this accurate, 50% speed, and then I'm not going to touch the knob again. Pardon the phrase. I'll leave it at that setting for the Bachmann as well. So we've got exactly the same amount of power going to the loco. Here we go. So that has shot to 0.246, that's 0.28 newtons, okay? And the loco is just running normally. In fact, if I let go, it will carry on. Okay, Bachmann's turn then. So I've left the controller where it was, it's still at 50. Let's hook this up, make sure we're in about the same place. Right, hit this with half power again. Ooh. So, I think it's settling. That has risen a little bit further than the Hornby, so that is at 0.3, it's between 0.32 and 0.34, so about 0.33, but the wheels, can you see the wheels? Barely turning around at all. So yeah, the Bachmann will haul more, but it will slow down dramatically. The Hornby will haul a little bit less, but it will do so without complaint, as it were. So let's put that to the test. Let's get some Great Western coaches and see whether that proves to be true. So up first here is the Bachmann with a 7-coach rake of Great Western coaches. That seems about reasonable for a whole class. Seems to be going pretty slowly already. And now that it's reached the hill and that curve, it's slowed down even more. Let's see what happens. So yeah, ooh, look at that. That's a very dire struggle at the top of Gordon's Hill there. That's a very noticeable slowdown, but it has managed it. Let's keep watching. Okay, so I think we can say that is a pass. It's very laboured, and this is at 50% speed. And I will do the same test again after we've seen the Hornby at 40% speed and see what the difference is. But for now, I think we'll move on to the Hornby Hall class and see what she makes of 7 Great Western coaches. And here comes the Hornby Hall at the exact same speed on the controller, which is noticeably much faster. Now, remember, without a load, I thought the speed seemed about the same between the two models. But now with the coaches, the Hornby is far, far faster, which just proves how much more torque there is in the Hornby mechanism and how much less the Hornby mechanism struggles when coupled up to a load. Absolutely zero wheel slip as well, even though the Hornby is a lighter loco. So we'll leave the Hornby one on. Now we're going to get really nasty and turn the speed down to 40. Here we come then at 40 speed. Now this is harder for a loco because obviously it's having to do the same thing but with less power coming out of the controller, so it's a real test of the efficiency of a mechanism. So watching on those curves, no real slowing down. I suppose the ultimate failure of this test would be to stop entirely, but I don't think either of these will. And then the top curve there, let's see. Yeah, I think maybe we've got a little bit of wheel slip going on there, so maybe the loco's lightweight is showing through, a bit less momentum at the lower speed, so it's not unexpected to see a bit of that, but at 40% Hornby have passed. So let's do the same with Bachmann. So it's not looking good for Bachmann so far. I started it and the thing just didn't move. Giving it a push and it's now moving at 40 speed. So I think the inefficiency of the Bachmann mechanism is clear to see before it even reaches the hill. And now that the incline is starting, it's slowing down even more. Maybe I was wrong about this, managing it up the hill. Right, so the second radius curve, and we know this from past videos about the Bachmann Hall, upset it quite a lot there. It slowed down a lot, and there's another one here. Yeah, noticeable slowdown on that, but now it's a bit easier because we haven't got curves. Oh dear, look at that. So I think it's safe to say that even though the mechanism in the Hornby Hall is worse than we normally expect to see from Hornby, it's still outperforming the Bachmann mechanism, which is actually fairly standard from Bachmann. So there you have it. That is fairly conclusive proof of my fairly common claims that Hornby's mechanisms are better than Bachmann's. And I think we've got a problem. So this is strange, because we know the Bachmann Hall is heavier than the Hornby, and yet the Hornby completed this challenge without actually stopping. So what's actually happened here is, because the Bachmann Hall is running so slowly due to its lack of torque, it's actually running with far less momentum. And so it's just lost all its energy just before the top of the hill. Now it's not derailed or anything, or none of the coaches have, because if I give this a push, you'll see that once it recovers, and see how fast the wheels turn when I give it a push. So it's trying to go faster. I'm not like faking it by turning the controller down. It wants to go faster, but it just doesn't have the power. And yes, if I do this with any of my other Bachmann Halls, it will be the same. Here you go. This is at 40 speed, folks, and even though this one has less weight on board, it's still not turning its wheels. Oh. What was that? That was bizarre. It didn't seem to be struggling, and then it suddenly started wheel slipping. Alright, well, it's speeding up a bit. I'll check in with you in about 20 minutes when it's reached the bottom of Gordon's Hill. Right, it's picked up a bit of speed now. So don't forget, this is the same mechanism, it's just a little bit lighter, because this version, when I first got it, was DCC fitted, and I've actually taken out the decoder, but I didn't have a weight to put into the slot. And as you can see, yep, that almost very, very nearly came to a stop, and I think it still might. It's only just able to stay in motion. Now if you remember what the Hornby was doing, and just look at the difference there, this is at the same power setting on the controller. Anyway, it's managing, it's still going. I think the other loco cleared the underside of the footbridge there. And as you can see, as expected, because it's slightly lighter, this one didn't quite get there. So in terms of mechanism and performance, there is a very, very clear winner here. So in conclusion, it's not entirely clear which will be the winner, and if you want to comment down below which you think is the winner, I'd be really, really interested to see which one prevails. I think from a visual standpoint, in terms of detail, finish and such, I think Bachmann just about wins it. I think we can say that. It's pretty close and Hornby is better in some areas, but overall I think Bachmann wins. But then when it comes to mechanism and performance, even though the two are closer than you might expect, Hornby's, I think, wins. Obviously on paper, the mechanism slightly better, and in practice the mechanism and the performance is quite a lot better than Bachmann's. So if price isn't a factor in this little competition, I would say that Hornby just about wins because of their slightly better performance. But when you remember that the Hornby Hall class is £65 cheaper than the Bachmann one, I think the answer becomes far, far clearer. With Bachmann's Hall, you're definitely paying for features that you are not getting. And so for me, when you bring price into the equation, Hornby becomes the clear winner. We may never see any better hall classes than these two locos, which I suppose makes the decision between which of the ones you go for quite important. Bit complicated actually to get a Hornby Hall class because the only one currently on their website is Hogwarts Castle, and that won't be everybody's cup of tea. But hopefully Hornby will bring the old hall back, maybe in the railroad range, maybe they'll upgrade it, I don't know, I've never known Hornby do that, but if they did, that would make a really compelling hall class, wouldn't it? But I think that's just about it. I really hope you've enjoyed seeing this comparison. It was quite interesting actually when I came up with this idea. I knew it would be quite interesting because the models are very different yet quite similar too in various areas. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any more suggestions for similar videos to this, do also pop those down in the comments. But for now, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and I will see you on the next one. All right, cheers everybody.